The concept of the missing wedge is built off the famous documentary Free Solo, which captured the story of Alex Honnold climbing El Capitan in 2017. In this daring feat, Alex climbed the well-known cliff face found in Yosemite National Park. Many people have climbed this cliff before, but what was so novel about it was the fact that Alex climbed it without the benefit of any ropes, harnesses, or safety anchors, sometimes called wedges, to help secure him to the rock face. This level of daring is what made the documentary so compelling. We assume that he didn't die. After all, that would have made the news and likely would have been part of the lead-up to the documentary. But still, the act of putting himself in such serious risk and danger was captivating. Throughout the documentary, we learned about his elite training regimen, the food he ate, and the careful attention he had to pay to every inch of the rock face. He even needed to take into account the humidity that day. If it was even slightly too damp, the climb would have been impossible. The film also explored the support group he built around himself, including his friends, camera crew, and girlfriend. Even as a world-class climber who had trained meticulously, the first time he attempted the climb, he realized he was not up to the challenge that day. His internal compass told him, today is not the day. And so, in front of all his community, he had to abort the attempt. It was only on his second attempt that he successfully summited the rock with no safety equipment holding him to it. There are only a few people in the world capable of such a feat. As I watched the documentary, the thought that crossed my mind was, there's not a fraction of a chance I could complete that climb. There was 100% chance that if I went out and tried that feat today, I would injure or kill myself. That reality, the sheer daring, is what made the documentary so compelling. Almost every one of us, as we watched it, had to admit that if we were to attempt to free solo that rock, as we are now, we would die. And so the empathy for the risk he was taking was truly something to behold. Most of us thought, that guy must be nuts. Or only a crazy person would do this. Or even, is this seriously the only way this guy can use his life? When it comes to our lives as leaders of organizations, whether a Fortune 500 company or a family, I find that we are free soloing almost all the time. Most of us have no safety harness, no safety wedges to secure us to the rock. If we make a mistake, we fall all the way to the bottom. But in our lives, we don't literally use safety harnesses, ropes, clips, and safety anchors or wedges. In our lives, these functions are filled by people. People who can tether us, hold us, and help reduce the length of our potential falls. Almost nobody tries to free solo El Capitan in proportion to the number of people on the planet, but most of us are free soloing right now. This is truthfully a fairly new phenomenon. Never before have leaders felt more isolated and disconnected from other people than they do now. The Harvard Business Review reported that a large portion of leaders feel isolated in their work. How is this possible in a time when we have never been so connected to each other through technology? It really is something of a mystery. For sure, we know that social media is terrible for mental health. All the evidence makes it appear as though it will one day be thought of as the new smoking. In our minds, we have made some kind of mental leap that confuses real, incarnate, or in the flesh, connection with online connection. Are texts, calls, and social media connections better than nothing? Maybe. They for sure can be useful when it comes to setting up incarnate connections, but we cannot substitute one for the other in the long term. What does free soloing in real life look like? Even if you are not a Bible-believing person, I think these two stories transcend culture well enough to demonstrate the point. The people of Israel initially did not have a king. In fact, for several hundred years, they were outliers in that they had a group of elders, a priestly population, and from time to time a role called a judge. Judges were not to be confused with kings, as their authority did not come from a coronation. They did not seem to have much of a formal power structure at all. They were nothing like judges today, who wear black robes and carefully examine case law. Judges were actually more like warlords, who were at times thrust into military leadership. When they had earned influence, they would then be leaned upon to judge between their countrymen. This was a very uncommon way of leading people in the ancient Near East. Most people groups had kings, each of whom led a city-state. There were some very large conglomerates of kingdoms, such as Assyria, Egypt, etc. It was out of this context that the people of Israel had their first king, a man named Saul. Saul looked like a natural-born leader. In fact, when people first saw him, that's immediately who they wanted him to be. Much taller than everybody else, handsome and strong. And he was. He was an excellent picture of a leader. However, in the first important mission where he was given a job to do, he didn't finish it all the way. In the story, God had told him not to keep any of the livestock or the people of the nation they were invading for himself. He had been told this by the very person who had made him king, the former judge Samuel. Samuel was exceptionally wise and had led the people of Israel himself before Saul ever became king. He understood well the pressures of leadership, and the Bible stories tell us that he truly loved Saul. He meant him well and wanted to do everything he could to help him. However, when Saul decided to try to please the people and his own ego rather than please God by keeping the best animals and the king of the people alive, Samuel came to confront him. If we can imagine the rock face of El Capitan, free soloing is when a person is climbing without ropes. There is nothing that can keep the person from falling to the bottom. The difference here was that Saul had a rope. He had a wedge available. Samuel could have been that person for him. However, rather than take responsibility, Saul first pretended that he had obeyed the command, then tried to deflect the correction, and finally decided to blame the people for his disobedience. He even made sure to blame Samuel for having missed a timeline. Samuel was there to be that anchor for him. Saul had messed up, and Samuel came to correct him. But due to a lack of humility, Saul fell all the way to the bottom. The missing wedge has two pieces. If you look at the diagram, you can click on a link in the description to see it, you will see an aluminum nut, also called a wedge, and a steel cable that attaches the climber's rope to the nut. Both parts must be present for it to function. In the story of Saul, Samuel was present. He was there. He was doing his job. It was as though the nut was safely secured in a crevice in the wall. There was only one problem. The second part of the wedge is that stainless steel cable, which I use to explain the concept of humility. Humility is the willingness to admit that we don't know everything, that we don't do everything right, and that at the end of the day, it's not all about us. We have things to learn. We have to be corrected. If we own our mistakes and learn from them, we can prevent our mistakes from becoming final in most cases. As I'm sure you're gathering, Samuel was present. The man with the wisdom and insight to correct Saul and get him on the right path was right there. But because of Saul's behaviors and his lack of humility, the story goes that God decided then and there to take the kingdom away from him. He was free soloing in his leadership, and the missing wedge was his downfall. The darkest part of the story was that the wedge was there. He just decided not to use it. Let's contrast this with a second Bible story, the story of King David. Many of us have heard of the shepherd boy David who killed Goliath. What we may not all know is that when Saul died, David was made king in his place. He has been called the greatest king the people of Israel ever had. David was different from Saul. He was by no means perfect. In fact, he made some critical failures of judgment and demonstrated poor character at times. In one particular story, the story of Bathsheba, David made a series of terrible decisions that ultimately ended in the murder of a friend of his. The setup went like this. Throughout his youth, David had been a leader of men. Much like Alexander the Great, David built a reputation by traveling alongside his soldiers and fighting alongside them. He never sent them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself, and they loved him for it. In fact, at one point, when David casually mentioned that he would love to have a drink of water from his hometown, which had been captured by an enemy kingdom, some of his most devoted followers fought their way with swords and shields through the enemy army, killing many opposing soldiers. They filled a cup with water and fought their way back to David. It's hard for many of us to walk from one room to another with a full cup of water. Now imagine doing it while fighting a sword battle with people determined to stop you. This was the love and devotion David had earned from his men. He had people in his circle who believed in him and trusted him. So it was a terrible fall for him when one day he decided not to go out to battle with his men as he used to, but instead stayed home in his capital city. He was on top of his roof and noticed a beautiful woman named Bathsheba, who was the wife of one of his most trusted soldiers. David abused his power, had her sent for, slept with her, and then sent her home. When it came out that she was pregnant and her husband had been out on the front lines for so long that it was impossible he could be the father, David tried to find a way to bring the husband home from battle so that he would hopefully go home, sleep with his wife, and the matter would be covered up. But the trouble for David grew when the husband, named Uriah, was such a faithful man that he refused to go home while his comrades were still out fighting. Since he wouldn't return home, David couldn't make it as though the child growing in Bathsheba was Uriah's. Rather than admit his wrongdoing and come clean, David decided to have him killed in battle, stooping so low as to send him on a suicide mission without his knowledge. He even sent the order by Uriah's own hand to the unit commander, knowing that Uriah had too much integrity to read it. Uriah died, and David took his widow as his wife. Now, from any objective standard, David's crimes were far worse than Saul's. Saul hadn't stolen anyone's spouse. Saul hadn't killed one of his most loyal men for the crime of being loyal. Saul hadn't covered up his wrongdoing, nor had he shamed his people the way David did. So what was the difference? David had a missing wedge, and he had both parts, the wedge and the cable, or a person you can trust to tell you the truth, and the humility to listen to them. A prophet named Nathan came to him and told him, in no uncertain terms, that he had sinned against God by what he had done. Here's the difference between David and Saul. Where Saul deflected, made excuses, and blamed the people he led, David received the rebuke, owned his part 100%, and asked God for forgiveness. Now let's not get it twisted. David suffered some very serious consequences for what he had done. One of his own sons would grow up one day to try to steal his kingdom. The child who was the product of his adultery died. His record as a great king was certainly tarnished. It's not to say that there were no consequences, but the way the biblical story goes, God forgave him because he humbled himself and listened to the man God had sent him. To be sure, David had isolated himself, believing for a season in some way that he no longer had peers. But there was still one man whom David had the humility to listen to. Nathan was his missing wedge. It's likely that only a few readers of this book have led a military campaign and taken spoils for themselves, or have had a mistress's spouse murdered. But these stories transcend time and place. Through my many years of leadership in nonprofit, higher education, ministry, and the marketplace, I have seen these themes play out over and over. A leader starts in a good place. They likely have a mentor or two they trust to provide them with good advice and counsel, what we will call in this book the mentoring relationship. They often have a few people in their inner circle at a similar stage of life and career with whom they can exchange ideas and commiserate, peer relationships. Many people who are gifted in leadership, even at a young age, have people that are pouring into themselves, what we call here the mentee relationship. We will get more into these relationships in later chapters, but suffice it to say that most successful young leaders have at least one, if not all, of these relationships in their lives. Communication and energy flow from their mentor into them. They process and synthesize that information with their peers. They even invest some of that energy in their mentees. This is the proper flow of energy. What we find is that as we develop in our careers, a separation begins to occur that splits apart these three types of relationships. We begin to facilitate distance between ourselves and others. We leave behind the wedge, and we begin to lose our humility, the cable. These two factors put us in a position where we are actively leaving behind the wedge and are free soloing in our leadership. In the next chapter, we will learn exactly how the separation begins, which is a process I call curation.